You look at your bank account and feel a strange mix of guilt and relief when you see it nearly empty. As if, in some hidden ledger, having less money made you cleaner, purer. I have been watching for years a peculiar pattern in people who unconsciously turn poverty into virtue and wealth into sin. These are people who, beneath their spiritual or moral justifications, are trapped in a cycle that sanctifies lack and demonizes abundance. This is not opinion. This is a precise map of the mind that believes, often without realizing it, that money and spirituality are mortal enemies. I will show exactly how that mechanism operates inside your head, how it creates a reality of scarcity you call a simple life, and how it systematically sabotages your chances of prosperity. More important, I will reveal the first concrete step to break that cycle and begin to reprogram your mind for a spirituality that includes abundance, not one that excludes it. Have you ever caught yourself secretly judging rich people as less spiritual while romanticizing your own precarious finances? If so, keep listening. In the next section, I break this down like a diagnosis. That first scene staring at the bank balance and feeling both guilty and oddly relieved seems small, but it is a diagnostic moment. I have seen that exact expression in hundreds of lives. When someone reacts like that, the mind is doing three things at once. It is defending identity, avoiding risk, and rehearsing a story about moral worth tied to lack. That small relief is not innocence. It is a signal. It says, if I have less, I am safe from corruption. And that belief is the central architecture of the pattern I want to expose. People who live inside this pattern tell themselves a tidy story. They are the ones who explain their choices with words like pure, detached, called, or less worldly. That story is their social shield. It works in two directions. To others, it makes them look principled. To themselves, it allows a quiet self-congratulation. I refused comfort for a higher cause. But listen carefully. The shield hides something ugly: fear. Fear disguised as virtue is still fear. And fear, when left unexamined, organizes behavior. On the surface, these people say they reject materialism. They speak against consumerism. They praise simple living. The language sounds noble. But if you watch what they actually do, you find a different rhythm. They avoid conversations about money. They undercharge for their time. They call generous discounts service to the soul. They let contracts lapse. They take one step forward in a project, then step back because it feels too commercial. They tell others they live from the essence, while their fridge is near empty. They are proud in public. They are quietly terrified in private. The cognitive dissonance is constant. It becomes exhausting. Listen, the image they sell is of moral superiority. The reality is constant scarcity. The contradiction is not accidental. It is organized by an internal rule. Scarcity equals sanctity. Abundance equals moral danger. This rule simplifies the world. It converts complex choices into a binary test of soul. But simplification has a cost. It removes nuance and it removes practical responsibility. You stop planning. You stop negotiating. You stop asking for fair compensation. You teach yourself that need is evidence of higher truth. That is the root of the problem. So how do they talk about themselves? Publicly, they speak of spiritual priorities and inner work. Privately, they have a different monologue. It often runs like this. I don't want to be one of those people who chases money. Money ruins you. I'll wait for signs. I'll hold to my values. It sounds noble, but embedded in that waiting is avoidance. Waiting is often code for not doing the uncomfortable, necessary work of managing resources. And the longer they wait, the more the waiting begins to look like commitment. They convert inactivity into principle. The social mask is polished with phrases, I'm not here for money. I prefer integrity. I won't sell out. Those phrases function as a moral firewall. They repel criticism and attract admiration. But they also isolate. When you say, I don't want money, partners, clients, and institutions hear a lack of professionalism. They make assumptions about your reliability. The firewall that was meant to protect your soul ends up protecting your scarcity. This is the contradiction at the heart of the disorder. The image of moral elevation produces practical outcomes of vulnerability. Inside this group, there is a set of rituals and signals that keep the pattern alive. They romanticize thrift to the point of self-neglect. They frame missed payments as proof of authenticity. They treat charity as an identity marker rather than a managed practice. They become experts at noble deprivation. That expertise becomes their daily currency. It shapes their choices in ways they rarely admit. They will refuse a well-paid offer because it feels too commercial. They will guiltily accept help from friends and then justify it as spiritual community. They are, paradoxically, dependent and proud of being dependent. Here's the deeper point. Their hostility toward money is rarely about money itself. Money is just a symbol. The real battle is about control and identity. If you accept money, can you remain the same person? If you ask for a fair price, will your community see you as compromised? Those are the questions that haunt them. The answer they have learned is to avoid the test. Avoidance becomes a strategy that, over time, looks like a moral stance. So what does that behavior produce in the world? It produces a particular pattern of relationships and opportunities. Employers and collaborators notice the reluctance. They start to assume you won't push for what you deserve. Clients learn they can pay less. The market responds to the behavior you broadcast. The universe, meaning the real-world consequences of your actions, mirrors your posture. You act poor, you are treated as such. You accept being treated as such, and the cycle completes itself. This is not mystical. It's a simple feedback loop. Let me be clinical for a moment. There is an internal narrative, and it reliably generates observable outcomes. The narrative says, if I stay small financially, I stay pure. The emotion tied to it is guilt mixed with fear. The habitual reaction is refusal. The consequence is continued scarcity. The person then interprets scarcity as proof that their original stance was righteous. They say, see, the world tests me. I should not be tempted. That loop is itself the teacher. It teaches the mind to keep the rule intact. It becomes self-validating. You will see this pattern perform across professions. Therapists, artists, teachers, spiritual guides, those whose work is framed as service are particularly prone. Their value proposition in public is transformative care, not commerce. That positioning makes the transition to asking for money feel like a betrayal. And so they never practice it. They never test it. They never learn that charging fair prices can be an act of integrity, not betrayal. Each missed test cements the identity. Now I need to be blunt. Many of these people actually believe they are above the needs that trouble others. They tell themselves they are in the flow. They refuse the language of scarcity and call it trust. That is seductive because trust is a virtue. But trust without competence, meaning trust without the skills to manage financial reality, is naivete masquerading as virtue. I say this not to shame, but to sound an alarm. The cost is not theoretical. It is bills, healthcare deferred, relationships strained, and potential unrealized. There is more. The social ecosystem around these people often reinforces the pattern. They attract friends who validate their stance. They are praised for sacrifice. Communities reward the display of detachment. In other words, scarcity can be socially reinforced. The person receives applause for being different. That applause makes the pattern sticky. It supplies emotional fuel. The more you are praised for being poor, the less likely you are to change. That is a paradox many cannot see from the inside. I do not want to make this sound like simple hypocrisy. Many of these people are sincere. Their motives are mixed. They are often seeking depth and meaning. They resist materialism for reasons that begin noble. But sincerity does not guarantee wisdom. You can sincerely choose a course that harms you. That is why diagnosis must be cold and precise. Sympathy alone will not break the loop. Now, let me describe what a day looks like for a typical person in this pattern. They wake up and check messages. They tell themselves today will be different. Are you nodding? Do you recognize this in yourself or someone close? If so, know that recognition is the first step of diagnosis. Do not be relieved too quickly. Recognition is necessary, but not sufficient. The next step is understanding the variety inside this tribe. There are subtypes. Each subtype dresses the fear differently, and the subtype determines the strategy that will work to change it. Before I outline those subtypes, a brief human note. If you are watching this and you have made it this far, thank you. I am building a space where these conversations are possible. This channel is new and I am trying to reach 1,000 subscribers to keep producing content like this. If you found this useful, please subscribe and leave your city and country in the comments. Small gestures like that help this work reach the people who need it. Thank you. Now back to the diagnosis. The first subtype I encounter is the one who wears suffering like a badge. They will tell anyone who listens how little they have and how proud they are of it. Their speech is full of examples of sacrifice. They will post photos of sparse wardrobes and simple meals and call it virtue. I call them the martyr spiritual. They thrive on proving how little they need. Their inner story is suffering equals purification. Their day-to-day is a ritual of deprivation. The consequence is predictable, chronic instability and the moralization of their own neglect. They are admired and pitted in equal measure. A slightly different subtype is the moral Puritan. Their posture is judgmental. They examine wealth under a microscope and detect corruption at every turn. They assume that success implies moral bankruptcy. The Puritan uses moral outrage to distance themselves from money. They are quick to critique wealthy people and demand ethical purity. But their rigid moral lens blocks nuance. Their stance can make them aggressive toward anyone who deviates. It also keeps them from experimenting with abundance in a healthy, discerning way. Then there is the saboteur, perhaps the most insidious. On the surface, they want stability. They make plans. They dream of financial ease. But at the first sign of real gain, they find a higher reason to step back. They procrastinate. They overcomplicate. They need more time for spiritual growth. The pattern is betrayal. They self-sabotage the very opportunities they say they want. The saboteur is dangerous because they confuse desire with intention. They believe they want better, and at the same time their unconscious mind is skilled at preserving the familiar state of lack. Finally, the conspiracy theorist of the spiritual world builds an ideological fortress. They weave elaborate narratives about systems being corrupt and money being fundamentally evil. They find confirmation in every headline. Their belief becomes an identity. Refusing money is resistance. That identity can be empowering in the short term, but it can also be totalizing. It leaves no room for pragmatic choices. Systems are complex. Refusing them wholesale is rarely a sustainable strategy. Each of these subtypes has a different danger. The martyr risks bodily depletion. The Puritan risks moral rigidity and isolation. The saboteur risks wasted talent. The conspiracy theorist risks cynicism that shuts off possibility. But they share a root. Each of them treats money as a moral category rather than a neutral tool. And that misclassification shapes behavior in consistent ways. At the center of all this is a belief system that I want to name now. It runs like software in the background. It says, "My worth is proven by how little I need." From this belief flow fears, emotions, and actions. Each time you test that belief and keep the same result like you reinforce the software. The mind is an efficient machine. It turns stories into habits, and habits into identity. The sad irony is that the identity they construct to be pure traps them in a kind of poverty that feels dignified. They lean into dignity like a comfortable but degrading garment. So what is the practical consequence? It is this: opportunities that require business sense, negotiation, or assertive boundary setting will be missed or mishandled. Projects that could scale are kept deliberately small. Relationships strain under unspoken resentments. Health is risked. The spiritual mission, which was supposed to be the source of meaning, becomes the alibi for inaction. The person is then left with two things: a reputation for purity and the slow erosion of life options. That erosion is real. It is measurable. It is not romantic. Now I will close this section with a simple but hard truth. Moral postures do not protect you from the laws of cause and effect. The universe will not bless a posture if that posture consistently produces neglect. If you preach detachment and then refuse to care for your family, the world will respond with consequences. That response is not punishment. It is coherence. Your inner patterns generate outer outcomes. That is the mechanism. It is merciless because it is blind. It cares only about alignment. In the next part, one will describe those subtypes in cinematic detail day by day. I will show you micro scenes where the belief quietly directs decisions. You will see yourself in those scenes, or someone close to you. And once you see the pattern, the possibility of change starts to look less mysterious and more like technical work. Stay with me. In the next section, I will name each subtype and reveal the exact story that tells their life. I said there are subtypes, and now I will walk through each one like a clinical portrait. I want you to watch as if you were sitting across from a patient. I am the diagnostician. I describe what I see, not to shame, but to reveal the machinery. Each portrait will be clear, concrete, and a little brutal. You may recognize yourself in more than one. The first portrait is the martyr spiritual. You know this person. They have stories about sleeping on a friend's couch to avoid luxury. They keep receipts for cheap purchases as if to prove ascetic commitment. They say lines like, "I choose simplicity," but their choice often looks reactive. They equate suffering with depth. A day in their life runs on slogans. They wake up, scroll spiritual channels, and mentally tally how little they consumed. They go to work and undercharge. They accept unpaid offers because they are called to serve. At dinner, they sip water while friends order meals. Later, when the dentist calls, they postpone the appointment because my body is a temple, but I must trust. That last line is often the hinge. Trust is a virtue, but when trust substitutes for care, neglect wins. The martyr's core belief is that material comfort dulls the soul. Their root story sounds like this: if I indulge, I will lose what matters. They are protective of a fragile inner identity. The cost is slow bodily and practical collapse. Accounts go unpaid. Health warnings are ignored. The martyr justifies this as proof of faith. They will say, "I am being tested." Friends worry. Families step in and are met with defensive virtue. The martyr refuses help because receiving feels like betrayal. This refusal becomes a loop. It is easier to suffer alone than to face the shame of changing the self-image. If you see this in yourself, the mirror is honest. Your integrity is entangled with self-denial. That is the work to untangle. The second portrait is the financial Puritan. This person looks different because they are moralizing out loud. They are the ones holding a moral magnifying glass up to wealth. They will write long posts criticizing the wealthy. They will call out systems and individuals for moral failures. Their speech is piercing, but underneath the righteousness is a defense. If I distance myself and judge, I will not be tempted. They believe purity is preserved by exclusion. Their internal logic: the less I desire, the more I remain clean. So they create loops of condemnation. The consequence is isolation. Their networks are narrow. Opportunities that require collaboration with diverse people are lost. They are often right about certain systemic problems, but their blank rejection blinds them to useful nuance. They are morally consistent and practically stuck. A day for the Puritan includes meticulous scrutiny. They evaluate funding sources for every collaboration. They veto projects with the faintest smell of commerce. They lecture acquaintances about ethical choices. That posture wins social kudos in some circles. But when they need help, they have fewer allies. The Puritan self-protection strategy becomes a barrier to actual leverage. If you recognize this pattern, note the emotional shelter it provides. but also note the cost. Power without. Ironically, depth often grows in the laboratory of practice, not in the waiting room of inner preparation. This subtype needs concrete deadlines and external accountability. Without them, the mind will always find a noble reason to stall. The fourth portrait is the spiritual conspiracist. This person constructs an elaborate narrative where the financial system is evil, rigged, and inherently incompatible with spiritual growth. They read media through a filter of systemic betrayal. Their identity becomes resistance. They feel righteous refusing this system. The danger here is closure. When the world is a conspiracy, every opportunity is a trap. The conspiracist stops testing nuance. They opt out. Their life becomes a protest. Protests are powerful, but opting out of every institution without building alternatives is a form of abdication. A day might include sifting through content that confirms suspicion. Then, instead of building parallel structures that might actually work, they rant and circulate theories. Their refusal to accept complexity limits their capacity to act constructively. If you are in this group, you might feel morally superior too often and practically ineffective more than you admit. Across these portraits, a common thread is the belief root that organizes action. The belief is rarely explicit. It is felt. It is the whisper that says, "If I accept this, I will no longer be the person I imagine myself to be." That whisper becomes louder over time because your actions feed it. Each avoided opportunity is evidence. Each refusal authenticates the story. The mind loves coherence. It will prefer consistent paucity to chaotic plenty. That choice looks noble from the inside. From the outside, it looks like a series of avoidable losses. Let me tell you two short stories, one of collapse and one of subtle recovery, so you can see how these subtypes move in life. The first story is of Joao, a gifted holistic therapist. He studied for years. He had a small but loyal client base. A luxury wellness center in the city offered him a contract to teach a series of workshops at a professional rate. He panicked. The martyr narrative kicked in. "This is commercial. My work will be diluted." He turned it down. Months later, he was late on rent and had to borrow money from a friend. He told himself he was living this simple life. But the cost was real. Stress increased, sleep diminished, relationships frayed. Later, he justified the decline as a purification process. The loop continued until exhaustion forced him to confront the mismatch. That rupture is often the crucible for change, but only if one chooses to see the pattern. Joao's breakdown became a turning point because he finally admitted his fear. He started to test small offers, negotiated boundaries, and slowly rebuilt. The change was not mystical. It was deliberate practice. The second story is Anna, an artist. Anna had offers to sell her work at fair market prices. She believed pricing high would exploit her audience. So she underpriced or gave pieces away. Years passed in scarcity. One day a mentor asked a simple question. "If your work truly serves people, do you not deserve to be sustained by it?" That question reframed the moral landscape. Anna began to test pricing. She set a non-negotiable minimum. She practiced saying no. The first sale at the new price felt like betrayal. By the third sale, it felt like integrity. Her income stabilized and the quality of her practice improved. The subtle shift was this. She stopped confusing value with exploitation. She recognized money as fuel for her art, not an enemy. That reframe is small, but it changes everything. These two stories show the fork. Stay in the script and confirm scarcity, or begin to test new scripts and allow abundance to be possible. Abundance does not guarantee happiness, but the wooden dignity of romanticized poverty often guarantees limitation. The choice is messy but real. What ties these portraits together is an internal mechanism I have named the law of sanctified scarcity. It is not mystical. It's cognitive. It goes like this. Assign moral meaning to lack. Feel pride or purity when you lack. Behave in ways that preserve lack. Interpret lack as proof of moral status. The The loop is self-reinforcing and, crucially, it can be changed. It must be changed with both psychological work and practical experiments. You cannot merely decide to be open to money. You must practice decisions that contradict the old script. You must intentionally fail at comfortable avoidance and succeed at new, small actions. If you see yourself in any of these portraits, here are 3 practical diagnostics you can use right now. First, inventory your refusals for the last 12 months. Which opportunities did you decline? Write them down and notice why. Second, look at your language. How often do you use moral words when describing financial choices? Third, test a small, measurable change, a price raise, a deadline, an accountability partner. Measure the emotional reaction and the outcome. Small, concrete tests are the only antidote to abstract virtue. You might be thinking, is this just about making money? No, it is about agency. Money is a metric of agency in modern life. When you refuse to manage it, you surrender choices. And those choices are precisely the arena where your values are realized or squandered. The spiritual life is not an escape from consequence. It is a training ground to exercise ethical power in the world. Finally, I will say this clearly. None of these portraits is a permanent fate. Minds change. Patterns can be reprogrammed. But change requires both brutal honesty and practical courage. It requires admitting that some of your moral postures might be self-protective phantoms. It requires testing the boundary between principle and fear. That is why, after describing the subtypes, my next step is to reveal the exact internal law that organizes them and a sequence of micro-actions that begin to reroute the loop. Before I close, consider this question. Which of these portraits is most comfortable to you? Which one do you secretly admire in yourself? And which one do you avoid admitting? Those answers tell you where to start. In the next section, I will expose the invisible law that connects these portraits and show, step by step, how the loop runs. I will also show why the universe, in its blunt way, responds to whatever you habitually broadcast. If you want to break this, the next part is where the technical work begins. I told you there is a hidden law. Now I will name it and show how it runs like software in the mind. I call it the law of sanctified scarcity. The name sounds dramatic because the mechanism is dramatic. It deserves that clarity. At first glance, it is a simple association. Money equals contamination. Scarcity equals purity. But that surface phrasing hides a chain of signals, emotions, and actions that run every time an opportunity shows up. The law is not only a thought. It is a whole operational loop that converts an idea into destiny. Here is the skeleton of the mechanism. A stimulus appears, a paid offer, a chance to charge your worth, a windfall. The mind runs a rapid interpretive test. Is this consistent with my identity as pure, detached, or called? If not, an alarm bell rings. That alarm is not reasoned. It is felt. It shows up as a small tightening in the chest, a hesitation in the throat, a story that arrives ready-made. This will compromise me. That feeling then drives the decision. Decline, delay, underprice, rationalize. The action or inaction then produces an outer consequence. Money does not arrive. Stability does not build. Opportunities shrink. You might want to call that sequence superstition. You might prefer to label it moral idealism. But neither name captures its power. The law of sanctified scarcity is efficient. It takes input and reliably outputs scarcity. It is not about virtue. It is about conditional behavior. If you protect identity by avoiding money, you will be rewarded by the world with the very poverty you claim as proof. The universe, in this model, is not a moral judge. It is a mirror of consistent behavior. Let me map it step by step, in language you can test on yourself. Step 1. Symbolic assignment. Early in life, or in some formative context, you built a symbolic equation. Maybe a teacher, parent, or a community suggested that those who are spiritual do not chase profit. Maybe a story in your group framed wealth as the result of compromise. You accepted the story. You did not notice that acceptance meant wiring a filter into your perception. Now watch how the law looks in ordinary life. A client offers a speaking fee that would cover 3 months of rent. You get a visceral hesitation. A thought pops up. If I take that, I will seem commercial. You imagine losing spiritual authority. You write back with a modest counteroffer, or you decline subtly. You feel morally superior. 2 months later, you borrow money from a friend. You narrate the borrowing as part of your path. You invoke the law again. Each time you act on that visceral alarm, you send the same signal to your world. There is an economy here of identity maintenance. The less money you accept, the safer your internal story feels. Each act of refusal is a deposit into that story's bank. The law rewards coherence. It punishes ambivalence. If you value being pure of money, you will shape a life that confirms that value. That life will be lean, precarious, and morally applauded by some. It will also be fragile in ways that harm health, relationships, and impact. Let me be clear. The law does not require dramatic vows. It works in tiny economies of gesture. Declining a paid opportunity because it feels off counts. Giving a discount and calling it service counts. Letting a contract expire because I want it to be organic counts. These micro moves aggregate. Over months and years they form a portfolio of scarcity. Why does the law stick so well? 2 reasons. First, social reinforcement. Communities that admire detachment will praise your choices. That praise fuels the identity. Scarcity becomes a badge. Second, cognitive comfort. The mind prefers coherence. A life that matches a tidy moral story is easier to sustain than one in which you must constantly negotiate mixed motives and messy compromises. There is also an archetypal grammar at play. Many of these minds are wired to prefer motive purity over messy competence. They would rather be right about being right than be effective in the world. The law exploits that preference. It offers a moral narrative as a substitute for the discomfort of learning practical skills negotiation, pricing, contracting that feel unspiritual. So the person never builds them. The absence of skills then serves as fresh evidence that money corrupts, and the loop self-validates. Consider a small experiment you can run mentally. Think of one recent offer you rejected with an inner justification. Now replay it. Ask, what were the factual risks? What were the imagined threats to identity? How would you measure the cost of refusal? Be brutal. This exercise is not intended to make you feel guilty. It is intended to reveal the law at work. When you can see the chain clearly, the motor becomes less automatic. There is another layer, subtler and uglier. The law does not merely preserve identity. It also manufactures moral superiority. When you refuse compensation and wear your smallness proudly, you set up a hierarchy in which you are the morally advanced one. That posture has social power. It protects against criticism. It also protects against risk. If you never ask for money, you never have to be judged for pricing or business acumen. The law offers comfort under the guise of martyrdom. Now imagine what this looks like at scale. Think of networks of people who reward scarcity. Workshops where attendees clap when a speaker says, "I don't do this for money." Blogs where poverty is romanticized. Media that conflates suffering with depth. These cultures amplify the law. They turn individual loops into social norms. The result is predictable. Entire subcultures normalize precarious living. But the law is not indifferent to suffering. Its pathology is not that it harms the self. Its pathology is that it narrows moral imagination. It removes a person from the domain of responsible agency. Responsibility requires stewardship. Stewardship requires resources. If you sanctify scarcity, you remove the means of stewardship from the table. That is the real cost. It is also important to understand how this law hijacks spiritual language. Words like surrender, trust, and non-attachment are powerful. They can point to liberation. Under the law, they become cover for avoidance. Surrender becomes passivity. Trust becomes negligence. Non-attachment becomes refusal to plan. The The subtleties of language are turned into weapons against practicality. So what breaks the law? Not a pep talk, not a miracle. It breaks when small decisions contradict the old script and are repeated long enough for new patterns to form. The law is procedural. It responds to procedures. If you create a procedure, price increases, contracts, clear boundaries, and follow it with consistency, the universe will adjust its mirror. Before I give you the first concrete moves, I will say one more thing. The law of sanctified scarcity is merciless but honest. It does not punish you for being spiritual. It punishes the inconsistency of claiming spiritual motives while acting out of fear. It rewards coherency. If your life praxis aligns with a genuine commitment to service and you also manage resources, the world responds differently. It opens channels that were previously blocked by your pattern. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you tested a money-related assumption and measured the outcome? If the answer is never, or I avoid those tests, you already know where the law has its grip. The next part will not be kinder. I will trace exactly how that law runs as a repeating cycle in your days. You will see the same loop in 3 different contexts. Once you see it in motion, it becomes hard to pretend it is someone else's problem. And that recognition is where responsibility begins. The law becomes a habit when the cycle starts spinning regularly. I want to show you that cycle in motion. Watch closely. It is the same mechanism again and again in different costumes. Once you see one loop, you can spot the pattern anywhere. The cycle begins with an opportunity. A client reaches out. An invitation arrives. A potential sale appears. The first moment is neutral. Something new touches your life. In people bound to the law, that neutral moment is immediately translated by an internal narrative. The translation is fast. It is not rational. It sounds like, if I take this, I'll be selling out. A small moral frame appears and colors perception. That moral frame triggers emotion. The chest tightens. Guilt appears like a reflex. There is a flash of imagined future shame. The emotion does the heavy lifting. It shuts down curiosity. Instead of investigating the offer, the mind searches for proof the offer is bad. You begin to look for moral flaws in the other party, or for ways the situation might compromise you. The search is motivated by avoidance. Next comes the strategy of evasion. The person invents elevated motives. I want to make my work accessible. I will wait for the right alignment. I need more inner preparation. These are not always lies. They are often sincere rationalizations. But functionally they are stalls. They delay the hard work of negotiation or the discomfort of being judged. The stall system is elegant. It reframes fear as principle, then action, or rather, pattern non-action. The person undercharges, gives away value, postpones deadlines, or declines. The behavior looks principled. It is often applauded. At this point, the external world responds predictably. The offer either disappears or gets restructured at a lower value. Clients learn your hesitation and adjust their bids. Opportunities that would have sustained you shrink. Finally, interpretation. The outcome scarcity is reinterpreted as validation. I was tested and I passed. You tell yourself. Your community confirms the story. The moral identity is reinforced. The cycle closes itself and prepares for the next round. I will show you this loop in 3 concrete scenes. The first scene is the client with the generous stipend. You get an email. We'd love you to run a 5-hour masterclass. We pay X. Instantly, the old sensor activates. You picture being in a glossy venue, maybe interviewed, maybe scaled. The protective voice says, "That's commercial." You tack on a reason. "My work is for those who cannot afford luxury." You propose a much lower fee, or you decline politely. Weeks later, you see the center hosting other teachers. Your calendar is thinner. You borrow to pay for essentials. You call this taste for smallness, integrity. The loop has performed its script. The second scene is a creative moment. Someone offers to buy a piece of art at a fair price. You think, if I sell this for that much, I'll be exploiting my community. You lower the price or give the piece away. The buyer respects you for generosity. Friends praise your purity. The bills pile up. You will be tempted to say, "But isn't humility a virtue?" Yes, but humility is not the refusal to steward your life. True humility can coexist with good stewardship. Refusing to charge what you deserve is not humility. It is absence of boundary. Dressing absence in spiritual language is the trick. There's also a social economy to this cycle. When you accept the loop, you attract people who profit from your pattern. Clients who prefer cheap labor, friends who expect favors, communities that reward your smallness. This social selection is not conspiracy. It is ecology. Systems match patterns. If you signal low price and high availability, the world adapts. That adaptation reduces the friction to continuing the loop. Now consider the feedback dynamic over time. At first, the loop might seem like an occasional annoyance. Over months, it compounds. Small fees withheld become lost years of earnings. Opportunities declined become a portfolio of unrealized impact. The compounding is stealthy. The mind that carried a badge of purity ends up with a ledger of missed investments in health, learning, and relationships. I need to be blunt about emotion. The cycle breeds resentment. It looks virtuous until you start resenting those who don't share your austerity. You look at people who charge and feel disgust. That disgust insulates you. It becomes a defensive posture to hide envy. Envy then is translated back into moral analysis. Of course they charge, they sold out. The loop is circular not only in actions, but in effect. Let me give you two stories that map how the cycle evolves and how it can be interrupted. First, Joao. He is a therapist who refused a wellness center contract. He called it too commercial. For a while he felt noble. Then stress mounted. He could not pay rent. He began to blame external systems for his hardship. The emotional cost contaminated his practice. He became exhausted and less effective. The cold truth landed as a health scare, a hypertension diagnosis. That crisis forced a reevaluation. Under pressure, he reopened the conversation with the center. He negotiated boundaries. He would teach a single module, maintain his methods, and keep a clear cancellation policy. He also set a non-negotiable rate for any institutional work. The first session felt like a betrayal. By the third, it felt like integrity. He had to practice the voice of negotiation like a new muscle. That practice reduced the alarm and rerouted the loop. Second, Anna the artist. She had been giving away work for years. A mentor asked her, bluntly, "If your work helps people, will you allow it to vanish for lack of funding?" The question reframed value. She experimented with pricing, set a minimum, announce it publicly, and accept the discomfort of saying no. The first no felt like failure. The third no felt like a choice. Over time, Anna's income stabilized. She could afford materials, studio time, and a little health care. Her art quality improved. She discovered that pricing did not kill her integrity. It enhanced her capacity to serve. These interventions share a structure. First, an honest appraisal of the loop. Second, a concrete, repeatable test that contradicts the old script. Third, practical scaffolding, a friend to hold you accountable, a clear rate card, a time-limited experiment. The repetition dissolves the automatic alarm. New feedback arrives. The world responds to consistent new signals. Why do so few people perform these tests? Fear, and not the abstract fear of being wrong. The fear of losing identity. Identity is elastic, but changing it feels like death. So people choose the slow death of scarcity over what feels like a social death. Here's another catch. The loop can masquerade as spiritual practice. If you say to others, "I prefer to live simply," you will recruit allies. They will absolve you. That absolution prevents you from having to face the hard work of accountability. It is easier to keep the badge than to rebuild competence. You might be thinking, is this all cruelty? No. Many of these people are sincere. They genuinely want depth. They truly fear being corrupted by fame or money. The cycle does not indict sincerity. It indicts coherence. You can be sincere and wrong. That is the cruelest part. The practical takeaway from this section is simple. Pick one loop in your life and design a small test. Raise a price. Say no to one unpaid request. Accept one professional contract with clear boundaries. Measure the emotional reaction and the external outcome. Repeat for long enough to shift the pattern. One experiment will not free you entirely, but repeated experiments rewire the alarm. If you do nothing, the loop will eat decades. It will hollow out potential. It will make your spiritual life a series of justifications. If you decide to act, the loop will resist. Expect discomfort. Expect old friends to be confused. Expect the internal voice to call you traitor. That voice has been reliable. It is frightened. It will not surrender easily. In the next part, one will describe when the cycle finally breaks or collapses. I will show the exact moment when avoidance becomes unsustainable, when health, family, or opportunity force a bifurcation. That is where the real test begins. Will you double down on the badge, or will you accept responsibility for the machinery you have been running? The answer will determine whether your life becomes a testament of virtue or a lesson in avoidable loss. There is always a point where patterns pressurize reality until something gives. I call that moment the point of rupture. For many who sanctify scarcity, the rupture is not dramatic at first. It arrives as accumulated friction. Late notices, strained conversations with partners, a postponed dental appointment, another declined opportunity. The friction builds like heat in an engine. One day something cracks. The rupture often looks like a crisis, a diagnosis that cannot be postponed, a child who needs support you cannot provide, a partner who leaves because financial strain erodes intimacy. The stakes are suddenly visible. What was once noble sounding becomes untenable. The mask slips. You see the underlying structure. This is the moment that separates narrative from truth. I have watched the rupture happen in versions that are public and versions that are private. Sometimes it is loud, a bankruptcy, a hospitalization, a public failure. Sometimes it is quiet, a slow exhaustion, chronic anxiety, a gnawing shame. Both are revealing. Both force a choice. Choice is the core. At rupture, two roads appear. One continues the pattern. You double down on the script, reframe the hardship as spiritual trial, and defend your identity. The other invites a different kind of honesty, that your problem is not the world but the story you have been telling about it. If you choose continuation, the law keeps working. It is resilient. It will reframe losses as testaments to purity. Suffering becomes proof. That route preserves identity but destroys options. It also compounds damage to health, relationships, and capacity. The self who refuses support tends to grow brittle. Communities that once applauded smallness eventually withdraw. The applause cannot sustain medical bills. If you choose the other road, you begin the work that I will call reprogramming. Reprogramming is not quick. It is not a slogan. It is a systematic retraining of the responses that constituted the old loop. It involves 3 movements: diagnosis, small tests, and structural practices. Diagnosis is brutal and meticulous. You map specific refusals from the last year. You inventory every time you said no to a compensated opportunity. You ask yourself why. I insist, be precise. I didn't want to be commercial is a start. Then ask, what was the felt fear? If I take money, I will change. Then ask, what concrete outcome did that refusal produce? I couldn't pay X. This chain of cause and effect must be traced without pity for the ego. Small tests are the laboratory. You design experiments that contradict the old narrative. Take one client and move your price up by a fixed % for 3 months. Or accept a professional contract with explicit conditions. Or, if you have avoided receiving gifts, accept a windfall and plan its use. The tests must be measurable. The emotional reaction is part of the data. Track it. Say what you notice. Repeat. Structural practices change the scaffolding around decisions. This includes concrete habits, a published fee sheet, a bookkeeping ritual, a weekly planning meeting, a health fund. It also includes social architecture, accountability partners, mentors who do not romanticize scarcity. The rupture moved her from romanticizing poverty to sustaining an art life that actually allowed creation. The rupture is also a moral clarifier. It forces the question, what do you actually owe? For many, the answer is not the world, but the people who depend on you, the body that carries you, the mind that needs rest. Responsibility reframes purpose. Spiritual teaching that denies responsibility is, in practice, code for avoidance. There is another force active at rupture: grief. When someone lets go of the purity narrative, they grieve an identity. That grief is real. People who have been admired for their suffering lose a certain kind of social esteem when they stop suffering. Friends may withdraw without meaning to. You will feel lonely. Do not mistake this loneliness for failure. It is the cost of reorientation. The path out of rupture is not moralizing. It is craft work. You must learn to move with precision in 3 domains: money, relationships, and practice. In money, build predictable income lines, practice fair pricing, save. In relationships, speak plainly about needs, accept help, renegotiate roles. In practice, stay curious about how your work can scale without losing essence. These are technical skills. They are not betrayals. I also want to address a common fear, that taking money corrupts purpose. That anxiety is not irrelevant. There are real ethical traps in commerce. You must be discerning. The answer is not blanket acceptance. The answer is a discernment practice that allows ethical complexity. You can build guardrails, selective collaborations, transparency about values, contracts that protect method. These guardrails permit you to participate in economies without self-erasure. At rupture, many people expect a sudden moral enlightenment. Rarely does that happen. More often, change is incremental. You enter the world with a series of small wins. Those wins accumulate. The nervous system learns that money need not equal contamination. The identity reframes. The alarm quiets. But valuable caution remains. You will still test offers. The difference is that your test becomes a practice of stewardship, not avoidance. You might ask, what if rupture never arrives? What if someone simply persists with the pattern for decades? That is possible. For some, the slow smell of depletion is the price they pay. I am not here to shame that choice. I am here to describe its cost, and to point out the alternative for those who want it. One final, practical point about rupture: timing matters. If you wait until desperation, your choice is narrow. If you allow a strategic rupture, a design crisis of sorts, you can create leverage. This is not manipulative. It is planning. For example, setting a deadline to test a new pricing policy within 3 months gives you a contained rupture to force the new behavior. The controlled discomfort is often more productive than waiting for catastrophe. We are now at the place where the personal meets the procedural. Diagnosis has been offered. The cycle is visible. The rupture has been sketched. The next step is reprogramming in practice. That is where you learn to act differently under pressure. In the next section, I will give you a compact protocol, a 7-day ritual, and a 3-month structural plan to interrupt the law and rebuild choice. It is small, replicable, and intentionally uncomfortable. If you are ready to do it, the work begins. If you are not, keep measuring what you lose. Either way, the next part will give you a first map to move from rupture toward responsibly sustaining your life and your calling. The work of reprogramming begins where the habit lives, in small, repeated acts that the nervous system can learn. I do not promise fast miracles. I promise a method that is ugly and patient. Change is built by doing things that contradict the old story again and again until the old alarm loses its credibility. First, name the new posture. I call it stewardship. Stewardship is not ambition dressed as piety. It is the choice to treat resources as tools for care, craft, and service. Say this to yourself. Abundance is a capacity to serve, not a temptation to abandon my values. Repeat it until the phrase becomes less foreign than the old shame. Then create a 7-day ritual that is precise and repeatable. Every morning for 7 days, hold a note of money in your hands. Any denomination will do. Stand or sit quietly for 1 minute. Breathe 3 times. Say out loud, slowly, money is neutral energy. I will use it with integrity. I receive so I can give better. That is the seed. Do not spiritualize the words. Do not expect fireworks. Note how your body reacts. Write the reaction down. After the 7 days, begin a 90-day experiment that targets one behavioral habit. Pick one of these tests and commit to it. Raise your fee by 20% for 3 months and keep it public. Accept one institutional contract with clear boundaries, or refuse one unpaid request per week and say no with a short script. Make the experiment measurable. Track money in, emotional spikes, and what people actually say. This is laboratory work, not sermonizing. Now the scaffolding. You will need concrete architecture around intention. Publish a fee sheet. I mean a simple document with your offer, your price, and cancellation terms. Post it on your website or send it as a PDF to new inquiries. Set a bookkeeping ritual. Every Sunday evening, record income, expenses, and 3 decisions you will make about money next week. Open a small emergency fund and name it plainly, Health Plus Capacity. Transfer a fixed percentage every month, even if it's just 5%. Structure neutralizes moral drama. Accountability matters. Find one person who refuses the martyr romance. This is not a cheerleader. It is a witness who will call you when you slip back into the old script. Tell them the experiment and the date you start. Ask for 2 check-ins a month. Promise to be honest. The muscle of negotiation grows when others hold you to the behavior, not the story. I teach concrete language because avoidance often hides behind eloquence. If you are asked to give a discount, here are scripts you can practice. I appreciate the invitation. My standard fee is X. I can offer a community slot at a reduced rate if you want to discuss it as a sponsored place. Or, I cannot lower my rate, but I can provide a sliding scale for 2 spots in each group. Practice these sentences aloud. They will feel clumsy at first. That awkwardness is evidence that new wiring is happening. Let me bring back Joao. His first test was small and humiliating by his standards. He accepted one institutional module and insisted on a clear contract. He rehearsed his lines with a friend. At the first negotiation, he felt the chest tighten and old words rise. They will commercialize my work. He spoke anyway and named his conditions. The center wanted him precisely because he could hold both integrity and clarity. The first class earned him more than his rent for 2 months. But the real change was not the money. It was that each time he negotiated, the alarm light dimmed. Anna's experiment looked different. She announced a minimum price for her work publicly. She wrote a simple note on social media. Starting today, my pieces begin at X. I am experimenting with pricing that allows me to keep making. The reaction surprised her. A longtime patron paid the new price on a whim. A collector bought 2 pieces within a month. The money did not make her corrupt. It bought studio time and better materials. Her art deepened because scarcity no longer dictated what she could attempt. There is a frictional stage you must plan for. Old allies may misunderstand. Your no will sound like betrayal to some. Expect loneliness. Grief will come as you shed the social identity of suffering. Name the grief. Grief is normal. It is not a sign of failure. Say this to yourself when the praise for your past smallness arrives. Thank you. I heard you. I am choosing a different way to care for my work and my people. Structural practices expand beyond money. Set weekly practice slots for negotiation. Script 3 sentences that you will use when offered unpaid labor. Create an intake form for new clients that includes a clear statement of fees and purposes. Build income lines, a steady baseline, retainer, subscription, or institutional contract, a variable line, commissions, workshops, and a savings line. The goal is not to maximize income overnight. The goal is to replace panic-driven improvisation with predictable choice. Measure emotions like data. On your tracking sheet, include one column for alarm level. The new signal will gather strength if you continue. If you do not continue, the old loop will reassert itself. Pity, praise, and then the same smallness. One last practical test I give people. Choose a sum that feels like a personal threshold, a figure that makes you imagine losing something essential. Promise yourself you will not shame that number. Instead, plan to use it. Set a concrete use: dental appointment, a learning course, studio materials. Accept that you are allowed to spend on your health and growth. The first time I told someone to do this, she scheduled a dentist visit she had avoided for years. She returned from the clinic with less shame and more curiosity. That tiny act rewrote a narrative about deserving care. This is not spiritual bypass. It is slow work on the muscles that make ethical participation possible. If you finish a 90-day experiment and your alarm is less frequent, you have won. If you do not, you have data. In either case, you have more information than the person who keeps narrating purity while their life narrows. The next part shows what life looks like when these practices begin to change outcomes. I will show the concrete scenes you will recognize because they once belonged to people I know and maybe to you. Imagine the phone rings, and, for the first time in a long while, your first thought is curiosity rather than shame. You read the email and don't immediately imagine yourself corrupt. That is the simplest, most underrated effect of steady reprogramming. The option to be curious opens new trajectories. Picture a mid-morning call from a public institution offering a paid residency. Before, the mind would fasten on what this would mean for your integrity. Now you take a breath and ask two practical questions. What are the deliverables? What boundaries can I have? That pause moves the conversation from interior drama to negotiation. You begin to learn people are often willing to work with limits when they are clearly stated. See another scene. A collector offers to buy a work at market price. The old script says lower it or donate it. The new script says thank you. Ask for payment structure and offer a part of the proceeds to a cause you support. The sale happens, materials improve, and you fund a small scholarship for emerging artists. You have not lost purity. You have leveraged a resource into wider service. There will be tender moments where the old alarm still yells. You will feel a flash of guilt when a windfall arrives. Practice the ritual at night, hold the money, breathe, and then make a plan for it. Put immediate uses first, save for health, invest in skill, and allocate a portion for giving. Making a plan turns shame into stewardship. It also prevents panic spending that feels like guilt-driven escape. Relationships will shift. Some friends praised your smallness because it made them feel spiritually superior. They may be quiet when you announce higher fees. Expect friction. Explain the practical reasons plainly. Some will understand. Some will not. That is the cost of realignment. You will also discover new allies, people who respect competence and want to partner sustainably. Let me be clear about social dynamics. The applause for martyrdom is real and seductive, but it is brittle. When you start to practice stewardship publicly, you attract different offers. Institutional work respects clear terms. Clients who want low cost fade away. The ecology of your life changes because systems prefer predictability. You become easier to work with, and the world responds. Watch what happens to your schedule. The old pattern made you endlessly available because availability was proof of virtue. The new pattern turns availability into a choice. You set office hours. You create a cancellation policy. You keep time for your craft. Time becomes thicker. Work quality improves. People notice. They return. Consider a scene with a family crisis. In the past, you would have had to beg for help or borrow money in panic. With a baseline fund and predictable income, you act. You make decisions from capacity, not scarcity. Capacity feels like dignity. It also stops the resentment that accumulates when need becomes chronic. There will be moral tests. Someone will propose a lucrative project that treads on your ethics. The new pattern does not mean you say yes to everything. It means you can say no without shame, and you can also negotiate protections. You start translating vague values into contractual clauses. You preserve method and integrity while participating in economies that amplify your work. Small wins compound. A steady retainer frees your calendar for a long-term project. That project leads to better outcomes. Better outcomes attract better institutions. New institutions pay more. The loop flips. Instead of scarcity validating virtue, competence validates abundance. The narrative that money necessarily corrupts loses its power because you observe a different truth. Money expands what you can do when used with intention. Do not expect linear trajectories. Life will test you. You will have months of surplus and months of strain. The crucial difference is that the strain does not become identity. You no longer explain it as my commitment to purity. You see it as a temporary wobble to be managed with the tools you have built. There are internal subtleties. The voice that called you traitor will reappear as a cautionary friend. Learn to separate useful caution from default avoidance. Useful caution says, check the terms. Avoidance says, any gain will make me bad. When the latter speaks, run a quick data test. What is the actual harm? What is the remedy? If the risk is small and reversible, test the offer. If the risk is structural and non-negotiable, decline with clarity. Imagine now the cumulative effect over 2 years. You have built a small emergency fund, published a clear fee sheet, and completed 3 pricing experiments. Your studio gets regular commissions. You feel less afraid of checking bank balances. Your practice is steadier. You sleep better. You are not grandiose. You are alive to choices that used to be invisible. Grief appears alongside these wins. You will miss the old identity. You will lose some friendships. You will have to resist the urge to gloat. Practice humility that is not self-abnegation. Say this: I am trying to take care of my work and my body. Repeating it grounds you in intention rather than virtue signaling. The future I describe is not utopia. It is a life where you negotiate instead of avoid. It is a life where money is a lever for deeper work, not a test of your soul. It is a life where your values and your bank balance have a conversation instead of a duel. Next, we will look at what happens when the pattern changes at scale. I will show you how networks adapt, how reputation shifts, and how the resilience you build can protect you from future ruptures. The scene ahead is about consequences not just for you, but for the people and projects your work touches. We started by diagnosing a lie, that poverty equals purity and wealth equals corruption. We dissected the machinery that sustains that lie. Now we close with a mirror and a single, small step you can take right after this video. Ask yourself one brutal question. Where in your life are you romanticizing scarcity and calling it virtue? Be specific. Name one situation where you refuse resources while telling yourself a spiritually noble story. If you cannot name one, look harder. The pattern often hides in routine choices. If you found a scene, pick a micro-action you can take today. Here are 3 options. Option 1. Choose one service and raise its price by 20% for the next 3 months. Option 2. Accept one paid contract with explicit boundaries and a deposit. Option 3. Do the 7-day money ritual tonight and record how your body reacts. Pick one and commit. That single act is an experiment, not a moral verdict. I will give you a short script for the first conversation you will have after you decide. Use this when negotiation scares you. Thank you for the offer. My fee is X. I can work with you under these conditions. If that fits, let's formalize it in a brief agreement. Practice it 3 times. Read it aloud. Say it to a friend. The first time you use it will be awkward. The 10th time it will feel like breathing. Remember that reprogramming is craft, not confession. You will fail in ways that are instructive. You will win in ways that feel modest. Both outcomes are useful if you pay attention. Track what happens. Learn from the data. Over time, the alarm will lose volume and the capacity to choose will grow. If you are worried that accepting money will change you, Test the guardrails I recommended. Contracts. Transparency. Selective giving. Keep the parts of your life that require tempering and make them functional rather than symbolic. You will not become a different person. My final invitation is a compact truth. Compassion without competence can become a cover for avoidance. If you want to serve for a long time, cultivate both. Start small. Keep records. Ask for help. The rest will follow. If you stayed to the end, do this 7-day ritual tonight. Hold a note. Breathe. Say, money is neutral. I will steward it well. Then sleep and watch what changes by morning.